The morning of the funeral was drenched in rain, the kind that fell slow and steady like a clock counting down the hours of something sacred being put to rest. Claire moved through her house in silence, numb hands brushing across surfaces that had once held life and laughter. The kitchen smelled faintly of stale coffee, untouched since the night her husband, Matthew, never came home. His mug still sat by the sink, the faint ring of where his last sip had touched the ceramic haunting in its normalcy. She couldn't bring herself to move it. Not yet. Not today. The house was full of people but somehow remained silent. Mourners whispered instead of spoke, their voices soft with sympathy, with avoidance, with the awkwardness that came from not knowing how to offer comfort when comfort wasn't possible. The children were with her sister in the next room, dressed in black, their small faces pale and confused. Claire had chosen their clothes herself with trembling fingers, folding the collars down, brushing their hair, performing the rituals of motherhood on autopilot. She had done it alone because Matthew wasn't there, and wouldn't ever be again. The drive to the church was a blur. She sat in the back seat of the black car, hands clasped in her lap, the texture of her gloves suddenly unfamiliar and foreign. The windows were fogged with breath and sorrow. She watched the city move past in gray strokes, people with umbrellas and wet shoes going about their lives while hers had come to a full stop. Matthew's death had been sudden. A heart attack. No warning, no signs. Just a phone call at midnight and a world that shattered on impact. When they arrived, Claire walked between two lines of mourners into the church. She felt eyes on her from every direction, but they didn't touch her. She was somewhere else entirely, floating above the grief, suspended in the silence between heartbeats. The casket sat at the front, closed, draped in white flowers and a photo of Matthew from last year, laughing, sunlit, alive. The sight of it made her stomach clench. She hadn't cried yet, not really. She had screamed that night, alone in the bathroom, her fist in her mouth to stifle the sound. But since then she had been dry-eyed, hollowed out, a woman moving through grief like walking through thick fog with no map. The service passed in fragments. Music, prayers, the sound of her brother-in-law's voice cracking as he read the eulogy. Claire stood when she was told to, sat when she was guided, nodded politely to faces she didn't recognize. But her mind was elsewhere. It lingered on the last conversation she had with Matthew, the way he had smiled over his shoulder before heading out that evening, saying he wouldn't be long. It lived in the silence of the unanswered text she had sent him hours later, the cold panic when he didn't reply. She had gone to bed that night irritated, then scared, then broken. After the service, the guests filed out in small clusters, umbrellas blooming like black flowers against the pale sky. Claire remained behind with a few close friends and family, preparing to follow the hearse to the burial site. That was when Emily appeared. She had been late to the service, slipping in quietly, sitting near the back. Claire hadn't seen her until now. Emily approached with slow steps, her face drawn, her eyes red. She looked like grief itself, all trembling limbs and silent apologies. They had been friends for nearly 15 years. College roommates who had stayed close through the chaos of adult life. Jobs, marriages, babies, relocations. Emily had been there for every milestone, always loyal, always kind. When Matthew proposed, Emily had been the first person Claire called. When the kids were born, she had come with meals and blankets and stories to make Claire laugh when she thought she couldn't handle another sleepless night. She had known Matthew almost as long as Claire had. They shared inside jokes, teased each other like siblings. They had always felt safe, easy, familiar. When Emily reached her, she didn't speak at first. She just reached for Claire's hand and held it. Her grip was firm but her fingers trembled. Claire glanced at her, seeing something strange in her face, something unreadable beneath the surface of sorrow. It wasn't the look of shared mourning. It was sharper, almost panicked. Before Claire could ask anything, Emily squeezed her hand harder and leaned close, her lips barely moving as she spoke. And what she said was not a comfort, not a memory, not a goodbye. It was something else entirely. Something that made Claire's breath catch and her knees lock to keep from collapsing. Everything blurred after that. The procession to the cemetery, the priest's final words, the shovels scraping earth. It all faded into a dull humming silence. Her body went through the motions, But her mind was stuck on those words, that confession, that truth that didn't belong in this moment, in this place. It felt like a betrayal of grief itself, as if mourning should have been sacred, untouched by secrets. But Emily had broken that. With one sentence, she had opened a door Claire didn't know existed. And now the darkness inside it was spilling out, flooding everything Claire thought she had understood about her marriage, her friend, her life. She didn't confront her, not then. She couldn't. She didn't have the strength. She stood by the graveside, people murmuring condolences she barely heard, and felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. The man she had loved, buried beneath her feet. The friend she had trusted, standing somewhere behind her with truth heavy on her tongue. And Claire? She was in the middle, in the eye of the storm, suddenly unsure whether her life had ever been real, or if it had all been a carefully curated illusion shattered by 6 words and a trembling hand at a funeral. The days following the funeral passed in a haze of routine and numbness. Claire moved through them like a figure behind frosted glass. Visible, responsive, yet emotionally unreachable. People came and went, casseroles piled up in the fridge, flowers wilted in vases she hadn't changed the water in. Her children needed her and she gave them what she could. Hugs that lingered too long, answers to questions she couldn't fully process, and a presence that was warm but hollow. She responded to messages when she remembered, smiled politely at neighbors offering sympathy, but her thoughts were never fully in the moment. They were somewhere else, looping again and again around what Emily had whispered at the funeral, the words that had detonated quietly beneath the surface of everything. At night, sleep came in fragmented pieces. She would drift off only to bolt awake, drenched in sweat, her mind recreating versions of the past she was now unsure were real. Every memory with Matthew became suspect. She would recall a dinner party, a family trip, a quiet evening watching television, and then find herself scrutinizing every detail. Had Emily been there? Had Matthew looked at her differently? Was there a gesture, a glance, a silence that now screamed with hidden meaning? She couldn't trust herself to answer. Her memories betrayed her, feeding her doubt like slow poison. She didn't tell anyone. Not her sister, not her therapist, not even the mirror when she dared to look herself in the eye. What was there to say? That in the midst of grief, her best friend had leaned in and confessed something terrible, something intimate and unforgivable? That the moment she should have been mourning the man she loved, she had instead begun mourning the life she thought they had shared? Emily hadn't explained much. Just the implication that it hadn't been just friendship between them. Just enough for Claire to understand that something had happened, maybe recently, maybe long ago, but enough to shatter the illusion she was clinging to. The certainty of her own place in her husband's heart. She tried to bury herself in the logistics of death. She met with lawyers, went through accounts, sorted paperwork. Every document she touched had his name on it, his handwriting, his fingerprints on their life together. It hurt in a dull, consistent way, like pressing a bruise that would never fully fade. She avoided the bedroom as much as possible. His scent still lingered on the pillows in his closet, in the drawer where he kept his watches and cufflinks. She didn't open that drawer. She didn't think she could. Emily didn't reach out. Not immediately. Not in the first week, not even in the second. Claire kept expecting her to. Each time her phone buzzed, each time someone knocked at the door. But she didn't. And that silence was its own message, heavy and conspicuous. Claire didn't know if it meant shame or fear or something else entirely. Part of her hoped it meant regret, that Emily had spoken impulsively, overcome by emotion, and now realized the damage she'd done. But another part of her feared the silence meant calculation. That Emily had waited for the moment when Claire was most vulnerable to reveal a truth that had long been waiting, just beneath the surface. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the funeral, Claire found herself in the garage, going through boxes that hadn't been touched in years. She needed something to do with her hands, something physical that might distract her from the spiral of doubt in her head. Among old tools and holiday decorations, she found a box labeled Home Videos. She hesitated. Inside were years of footage, birthdays, vacations, school plays, lazy Sundays captured on camcorders and phones. She hadn't watched them in ages. Her breath caught as she pulled out one and slid it into the old DVD player in the den. The screen flickered to life. There was Matthew holding the camera, laughing as he filmed their daughter riding her bike without training wheels for the first time. Claire heard her own voice off-screen cheering. Emily's voice echoed a few seconds later, clapping. Claire froze. She hadn't remembered Emily was there that day. But there she was, stepping into frame, sunglasses on, grinning. Claire watched her closely, trying to read something, anything, into the way she stood next to Matthew. But it all seemed so normal. Too normal. And maybe that was the point. Maybe it had always been normal to have Emily there. Always part of their lives, always close. So close Claire had never thought to question it. She watched video after video. At first it was nostalgia that drove her. Then it became something darker. A need to find evidence, a clue. Something to justify the storm of feelings inside her. In one video from a New Year's Eve party, Emily leaned into Matthew to say something and he laughed. Claire watched the moment over and over, trying to detect the trace of a secret in his expression. But it was impossible to know what she was looking for. Every gesture, every word now felt layered with meaning she couldn't decode. She turned off the TV eventually, exhausted, her eyes burning. She had no answers. Only more questions. The next morning she finally sent Emily a message. 3 words. We need to talk. She stared at the screen for several minutes before pressing send. Her heart pounded in the silence that followed. She didn't know what she would say if Emily agreed. She didn't know if she wanted to hear more or if she wanted to beg her to take it back. But she couldn't live in this limbo any longer. She needed truth no matter how much it hurt. Minutes passed. Then her phone buzzed with a reply. A single word. Yes. Claire sat down, her knees trembling. For the first time since the funeral, she let herself feel the full weight of what might be coming. She wasn't ready. But she would go. Because the truth, no matter how devastating, was the only way forward. Claire arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, unsure why she had chosen this particular place. It was small, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower and people spoke in hushed voices. She chose a corner table near the window and sat down, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her back stiff with anticipation. Rain tapped softly against the glass, a steady rhythm that filled the silence around her. Her coffee sat untouched, growing cold by the second, but she didn't notice. Her thoughts were a swirl of dread, confusion, and longing for answers. The message Emily had sent her, just one word, yes, had been echoing in her mind since yesterday. Now she was moments away from finding out what that yes meant. When Emily walked in, it was as though the air shifted. Claire recognized her silhouette instantly, the familiar way she carried herself, the soft coat she always wore on rainy days. But there was something different, something fragile in her posture, something hesitant in the way she looked around before spotting Claire. Their eyes met. Emily's face tightened slightly, and Claire saw the storm behind her expression. Regret, fear, and something else she couldn't yet name. She made her way to the table with slow steps, sliding into the seat across from Claire without saying a word. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, the sound of the rain and clinking cups around them stretching the moment into a silence so dense it felt like it might crush them both. Claire noticed how tired Emily looked. Her makeup was barely applied, her eyes swollen from lack of sleep, lips pressed together as though holding back a dam of words. Claire didn't know where to start. The last time they had been together, her husband had still been alive, her world still intact. Now, everything had changed, not only because of Matthew's death, but because of what Emily had implied at the funeral. The implication hadn't left Claire's thoughts for a second, and now that they were face to face, she needed clarity. Not half-truths, not cryptic remarks whispered over a grave, but the full, ugly truth. Because whatever Emily had to say, Claire could no longer protect herself by pretending ignorance. Emily finally spoke, her voice hoarse, trembling. Claire listened without interruption, her gaze fixed, her body tense. The words came slowly at first, as though each one was a burden too heavy to carry. Emily began with a timeline going back years, farther than Claire expected. She spoke of moments that Claire had never noticed, times when she and Matthew had found themselves alone after parties, conversations that turned too personal, late-night texts Claire had assumed were about family logistics or mutual friends. Emily confessed that it had never started with intention. It had begun with admiration, then curiosity, and eventually something deeper. They had crossed a line Claire hadn't even known existed. As the confession unfolded, Claire's breath came slower, more deliberate. Her body felt like stone. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her coat. She didn't interrupt. She needed to hear every word, even the ones that cut deepest. Emily spoke about guilt, about pushing Matthew away, about moments when they both agreed it couldn't continue. Moments that, according to her, never lasted. Claire felt like she was watching her own life unravel in front of her. The intimacy she thought had belonged to her marriage had been shared. The love she thought was hers alone had been compromised. Emily insisted it hadn't been an affair in the traditional sense. There had been no hotel rooms, no overnight disappearances. But there had been emotion. There had been longing. There had been secrets. Claire felt her stomach turn at the details. Private jokes, late-night phone calls she'd brushed off. Even one weekend when she had taken the kids to visit her parents and Emily had stayed behind for what now seemed like a far less innocent reason. The emotional betrayal felt deeper than any physical one. The knowledge that her best friend had harbored feelings for her husband, feelings that had been returned, was almost unbearable. Claire finally spoke, her voice low and strained. She asked questions: how long, why, when it stopped, if it ever really had. Emily's answers came with tears, with stammering, with the broken language of someone trying to rationalize the irrational. Claire listened, absorbing each answer with a mix of disbelief and painful clarity. She began to see the pattern, how both of them had lied by omission, how she had trusted too blindly, how easily love could be camouflaged by friendship and proximity. And all the while, her grief for Matthew transformed. It was no longer clean or noble. It was now tangled in anger, in betrayal, in the sickening realization that she had been mourning a man she never truly knew. When the conversation ended, neither of them had moved. Claire sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the rain sliding down the window, each drop a thin silver thread unspooling the life she thought she had. Emily remained still, her face a portrait of remorse, but her presence now felt foreign. There was no comfort to be found in their shared history. It had been rewritten with every word she spoke. Claire realized she didn't hate her, not entirely, but she could no longer see her as the person she had been. Something had fractured between them that couldn't be mended. They stood eventually, exchanging no parting words. Emily left first, pausing briefly at the door before vanishing into the misty street. Claire remained behind, her mind racing with images, voices, memories now soured by suspicion. She thought of Matthew's laugh, the softness in his touch, the quiet nights they'd spent lying side by side. All of it now felt contaminated. She had buried a husband, but the man she had mourned existed only in fragments. The rest had been hidden in the shadow of a friendship she had once trusted more than anything. When she finally walked outside, the rain had stopped. The air was cold, crisp with the sharp smell of wet pavement. Claire inhaled deeply, grounding herself in the present. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if forgiveness was possible, or if she even wanted it. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The truth had been spoken, and there was no taking it back. Now she would have to live with it, carry it, and eventually find a way to rise above it. But not today. Today she would walk home slowly, one step at a time, letting the weight of it all settle into her bones. Claire spent the following days in an almost mechanical trance, her routine stripped of warmth and purpose. She woke at the same time each morning, brewed her coffee, packed lunches for the children, and folded laundry with robotic precision. But inside, something had shifted irreparably. Every action was accompanied by a slow-burning ache that pulsed beneath her skin, a quiet scream muffled by responsibility and exhaustion. Her home had become a museum of contradictions. Walls filled with photographs of a life that no longer made sense, drawers that held letters and receipts now tainted by betrayal. Even the scent of Matthew's cologne, faintly lingering on a forgotten scarf by the coat rack, felt like an insult. She had loved him with the kind of trust that came only after years of devotion, and now that trust lay shattered, its shards buried in every corner of her home. The children noticed her distance, though they couldn't articulate it. Her son asked fewer questions, choosing to sit quietly beside her instead. Her daughter grew more independent, dressing herself, brushing her own hair, seeking comfort from a stuffed bear rather than her mother's arms. Claire watched them with a silent, aching guilt, knowing that her grief had become a barrier between her and the two souls who still needed her most. She wanted to be whole for them, to be the mother they remembered. But she couldn't find her footing in a world where the man she'd shared her life with had kept secrets so profound they made her question the foundation of their marriage. Nights were the hardest. When the house fell silent and the lights dimmed, memories crept in like ghosts. She would lie awake staring at the ceiling, retracing every interaction between Matthew and Emily that she could recall. At first, they seemed innocent, inside jokes, friendly hugs, shared glances at family events, but now they flickered with a different light. Her mind, poisoned by knowledge, replayed these moments through a new lens, twisting them into proof of intimacy that she had never noticed. She hated how easily her thoughts betrayed her, how doubt transformed the mundane into the monstrous. Eventually, she began sorting through Matthew's belongings. It was something she had avoided until now, the idea of it unbearable. But with the truth now partially exposed, she needed answers, even if they came buried in the seams of forgotten pockets or the margins of old notebooks. She started with his office. The room still smelled like him, paper, ink, and that faint earthy scent of his aftershave. His desk was exactly as he had left it. Papers were neatly stacked, his planner open to the week of his death, with appointments that would never be kept. Claire sat in his chair, running her hands over the smooth wood, bracing herself for what she might uncover. She opened drawers, flipped through files, examined old receipts. Most of it was normal, boring, even work notes, bank statements, medical forms. But then, tucked beneath a stack of faded documents, she found a small black notebook bound in worn leather. Her breath caught. She recognized it vaguely. He used to carry it years ago, jotting down ideas or reminders. She had assumed it was filled with business notes, harmless observations. But when she opened it, her fingers trembling, she realized it was something else entirely. Inside were pages of thoughts, reflections, fragments of letters never sent. Some were addressed to her. Words of love and fear, moments of vulnerability she had never heard from his lips. But others weren't. She found a page dated almost 7 years earlier. It didn't name Emily directly, but the reference was unmistakable. The entry described a deep confusion, a pull he couldn't explain, guilt over emotions he didn't fully understand. He wrote about the line between friendship and something else, and how easily it could blur when two people shared too much space, too much history. Claire read the words over and over, her heart sinking with every line. It hadn't been a momentary lapse. It had been a struggle, one he had lived with in silence, wrapped in affection and denial. Further pages revealed even more. References to needing distance, recommitting, and letting go all pointed to the same quiet battle. He had written about his love for Claire, about how strong it was, how he wished it could drown out the noise of whatever existed between him and Emily. But clearly it hadn't. The notebook was proof that the emotional entanglement had lasted longer than Emily had admitted. And whether or not it had ever become physical, the betrayal was undeniable. Claire closed the notebook slowly, her fingers tracing the cover. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. There was only silence, as heavy and suffocating as wet cement. She didn't tell Emily about what she had found. Not yet. She didn't know what she would do with the knowledge. Confronting her again felt pointless. Emily had already confessed enough to unravel Claire's peace. And yet something inside her stirred. A strange, cold resolve. She deserved more than half-truths and vague regrets. She deserved to know who her husband really was, who her friend really was, and who she had become in the process of being deceived. Later that week, she found herself sitting in her car outside Emily's house. She hadn't planned it. She had gone for a drive, restless and unmoored, and her hands had guided the wheel without her consent. The house looked the same as always, modest, tidy, with flower boxes in the windows and the porch light still shaped like a lantern. But now it radiated something sinister. It was a place where too many secrets had been kept. Claire stared at the front door, willing herself to get out, to ring the bell, to demand more. But her body wouldn't move. She just sat there, eyes burning, fists clenched in her lap, until her phone buzzed and snapped her back into reality. It was a message from her sister, asking if she was okay. She typed back a simple yes, then started the engine and drove away. She returned home exhausted, drained not by physical effort, but by the emotional weight of carrying a truth too large to contain. That night she didn't try to sleep. Instead, she sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the shadows shift across the floor. She thought of Matthew, of Emily, of the years she had believed in something sacred, untouchable. And she thought of herself, not the version shaped by grief or betrayal, but the woman who had survived both. The woman who now stood at a crossroads, unsure of what came next, but certain of one thing. She would no longer accept silence as an answer. She would dig until the full truth was laid bare, no matter how much it hurt. Because healing couldn't begin until the last lie was uncovered. Claire woke up with a weight in her chest that felt heavier than grief, heavier than anger. It was the weight of knowledge, of betrayal, of days spent circling the same unanswered questions. The notebook still sat on her nightstand, untouched since she had closed it days ago, but its presence loomed over her like a silent accusation. She had read every page multiple times, memorized Matthew's handwriting, examined the curve of his words as if searching for signs of hesitation or remorse. The entries were raw and tangled, clearly written by a man at war with himself, but that didn't lessen the damage. If anything, it deepened it. He had struggled, yes, but he had also chosen silence. And that silence had been her prison for years, even if she hadn't known it. The house had grown quieter since the funeral, as the visitors faded and life resumed for everyone else. Claire's sister had returned to her own home, the children were back at school, and the neighbors no longer lingered outside with concerned faces and casseroles. Claire was left with the echo of her thoughts and the slow rhythm of routine. She had stopped pretending to be okay. She moved slowly through each day, avoiding mirrors and photographs, eating when she remembered, showering only when the fog inside her became unbearable. Grief had transformed into something else now, something sharper and more volatile. Her sorrow had roots, but her pain had direction. She needed answers. She needed closure, even if that closure came wrapped in bitterness. One afternoon, as the wind howled against the windows and the trees shook their bare limbs, Claire found herself reaching out again. She called a name from the past, James, one of Matthew's oldest friends, a man who had drifted out of their lives over the years, but who had known Matthew well in the early days of their marriage. They hadn't spoken in over a year, not since a distant holiday party, but Claire remembered the look he had once given Matthew when Emily's name came up in conversation. At the time, she hadn't thought anything of it, but now that look echoed back to her with eerie clarity. There was something about the way James had watched him, a flicker of caution or perhaps judgment. James was surprised to hear from her, but agreed to meet. They sat in a quiet cafe, the same one where she had met with Emily. This time Claire chose a table in the center of the room, where the light was clearer and the silence less suffocating. James looked older, wearier, his beard touched with gray and his voice softer than she remembered. He asked how she was and she gave him the honest version, no sugarcoating, no brave smiles. He listened, and then she asked the question that had haunted her since the funeral. Had he known? James hesitated for a long time, stirring his coffee, eyes lowered. Finally, he said he had suspected. Not because Matthew ever told him directly, but because of what he'd seen, what he'd heard in passing. There had been a trip years ago when the three of them were at a conference together. He had walked in on a conversation between Matthew and Emily, something intense, hushed, that stopped the moment they realized he was there. He couldn't say for certain, but from that moment on, he had kept his distance. Claire listened, her pulse loud in her ears. It wasn't confirmation, not exactly, but it was enough to validate the instincts she had buried for years. Enough to make the world tilt further from what she had believed. After the meeting, Claire walked through the park in the fading light, letting the wind push against her, letting the cold settle into her bones. She felt hollow, like the core of her had been scraped clean. But there was also a strange relief in finally seeing the full shape of what she had ignored. She had built her life on trust, and now that trust had crumbled, but the wreckage was at least honest. The lies were out in the open. There was no more pretending. When she returned home, the children were asleep, their breathing soft behind closed doors. She stood in the hallway for a moment, just listening. Their lives were still whole in ways she could barely understand. They knew their father was gone, but they didn't know the complexity of who he had been. Claire didn't know if she would ever tell them. Maybe one day, when they were old enough to understand that people could be both good and deeply flawed. That love didn't always protect you from betrayal. That even the people you trust most can make choices that leave scars you never imagined. In the coming days, Claire began to clean. Not just in the practical sense, but in the emotional one. She cleared out Matthew's side of the closet, folded his clothes carefully into boxes she labeled but did not seal. She took down pictures, replaced them with artwork, or left the walls blank. She deleted old voicemails she had saved out of habit. It was a ritual, a way of reclaiming her space, of making the house her own again. Each action felt like a small rebellion against the lie she had been living in. She didn't speak to Emily again. There were texts, short, stiff, mostly about mutual acquaintances or logistics, but the friendship was over. There was no ceremony to its ending, no dramatic confrontation. It simply died in the space between the words they no longer shared. Claire mourned that too. Not just the loss of her marriage, but the loss of the woman she had once called her sister. The betrayal had been twofold, and the grief that followed it was layered and strange. Sometimes she still reached for her phone when something reminded her of Emily, before remembering that the bond was gone. One evening, as she was going through the attic, Claire found an old photo album, one she hadn't opened in years. It was from the early days of her relationship with Matthew, long before the children, before the marriage, before Emily became part of their orbit. The photos showed a younger version of herself, smiling, eyes bright with possibility. Claire traced the images with her fingertips, trying to remember what that girl had dreamed about, what she had believed in before reality had tempered her with pain. She sat there for a long time, the album on her lap, the attic silent around her. And in that silence she felt something shift. It wasn't healing yet. That would take time, and she knew it. But it was the beginning of a decision. She would not let this betrayal define her. She would not remain a victim of secrets she hadn't asked for. There was a life ahead of her. One not built on deception or quiet suffering. A life she would create on her own terms, with clear eyes and a stronger heart. For her children. For herself. For the version of her that still believed in love, even if it had been broken. She stood, closed the album, and walked down the attic stairs, the weight of the past lighter somehow, no longer dragging her backward. Tomorrow would not be easier, but it would be hers. And for the first time in weeks, that felt like enough. Spring came quietly, sneaking into Claire's life with soft sunrises and the distant scent of blooming lilacs. The world outside had begun to thaw, and with it, so had something in her. The grief still lingered, some days sharper, other days dulled like a bruise fading under the skin, but it no longer controlled her. It had become part of her rhythm, like a scar that catches the light when she moves just the right way. She no longer woke up with that suffocating weight in her chest, though the hollow spot where Matthew once lived in her heart had not disappeared. Instead, it had transformed into something quieter, something she had learned to live with. The house had changed too. Subtle things at first. New curtains in the bedroom, different photographs in the hallway, rearranged furniture in the living room. But those small shifts echoed something deeper. Her reclaiming of space, her refusal to be haunted. She had painted over the wall in the kitchen where Matthew had once marked the kids' heights each year, not out of cruelty or detachment, but out of necessity. The past was preserved in memory. It didn't need to loom over every meal, every conversation. She kept a few of his things, his favorite book, a worn sweatshirt that still smelled faintly of him, and the watch he wore every day, but most of it had been packed away. Some boxes she donated. Others remained in the attic, unopened but no longer feared. Her children had adjusted in their own ways. Her son had grown quieter, more thoughtful. He asked deeper questions now about life, about fairness, about truth. Her daughter, still too young to understand the layers of what had happened, had returned to giggles and make-believe games. Her resilience a daily reminder that healing was possible even after loss. Claire made it a point to be present for them, not just physically but emotionally. She listened more intently, hugged them more often, and let herself laugh with them even when the laughter felt foreign at first. Slowly, piece by piece, she was building something new. But not everything had resolved. There were days when she still thought of Emily, though the image had dulled with time. The anger had cooled into something more complicated. A mixture of sorrow, nostalgia, and lingering confusion. She hadn't spoken to her since the weeks after Matthew's funeral, and that distance had become its own kind of closure. Claire no longer waited for an apology, or even an explanation. She had stopped needing it. What she had come to understand was this. Forgiveness wasn't something she owed anyone. It wasn't a door to be opened for the sake of closure. It was a path she could choose to walk for her own sake when she was ready. One evening, as the sky shifted into hues of gold and lavender, Claire sat on the back porch with a cup of tea in her hands. The garden, neglected for months, had begun to sprout new life. Green shoots pushed up through the soil, defiant and tender, reminders that everything, no matter how broken, could begin again. The birds had returned too, their songs weaving into the wind like quiet affirmations. For the first time in what felt like years, Claire didn't feel like a woman defined by grief. She felt like a woman rediscovering her shape. She thought of the notebook again, the one she had once kept on her nightstand like a talisman. She hadn't opened it in weeks. It remained in the drawer beside her bed, untouched and unread. She no longer needed its confessions to confirm what she already knew. Matthew had loved her and he had also failed her. Both things could be true. Both things had been true. She would carry that contradiction for the rest of her life, but she no longer needed to solve it. The man she had buried was not the man she had imagined, but he had also been her husband, the father of her children, the one who had once made her laugh until she cried. Mourning him meant accepting all of him, the loyalty, the weakness, the silence, the love. Claire had begun writing again, something she hadn't done in years. Late at night, once the children were asleep and the house had quieted into that familiar hush, she would sit by her bedroom window and pour her thoughts into a notebook of her own. At first, it had been aimless, fragments of feeling, observations about grief, disconnected memories. But over time, a narrative had begun to take shape. Not about Matthew, not directly, but about a woman rebuilding herself from the ashes of loss, about rediscovery, resilience, and the quiet, slow return to selfhood. It wasn't for publication. It wasn't for anyone. It was hers alone. A way to reclaim her voice in a world that had once silenced it with secrets. She began going on walks again too, not out of obligation but for clarity. The air felt different now. She noticed the warmth in the sun, the sound of children's laughter echoing through the neighborhood, the scent of fresh grass and earth. These were the details that had once been muted by her grief. Now they returned with color and weight, tethering her back to the present. One afternoon, she even allowed herself to sit at the cafe where she had once met Emily and James. The place hadn't changed, but she had. She sat in the same seat, ordered her usual tea, and watched people pass outside the window. It felt like closing a loop, like reclaiming a moment that had once been stolen. In time, Claire found herself imagining a future again. Not in grand declarations or sweeping visions, but in subtle hopes. A trip with the kids to the coast. A new job opportunity she was considering. A garden she wanted to plant that summer. These thoughts, small and quiet, were the first signs of something she hadn't dared believe in possibility. She knew she wasn't healed, not fully, but she was healing. And that distinction mattered. One night, months after the funeral, Claire stood in her bedroom, the window open to the night air, and finally allowed herself to speak aloud. Just a whisper, barely more than breath, but it carried all the weight of everything unsaid. She didn't say his name. She didn't need to. The message wasn't for the dead. It was for herself. It was permission to let go, to forgive without forgetting, to love herself enough to move forward. It was a vow to choose life, even when it came wrapped in scars. When she lay down that night, the silence felt softer. Not empty but peaceful. And as she drifted into sleep, she dreamed not of what she had lost, but of what she might still find.